Okay, and finally, I'm pleased to welcome the next and last speaker for this session up, Alex Morgan, who is going to talk about his process of using his human brain to make decisions about how to fund all of this.
That's something, there we go. That's something I don't have good feedback on. Now I do, though. So great. I've actually known Larry Hunter for a little over 20 years. I just dropped out of graduate school and I was becoming an AI researcher. And recently he reached out and asked me if I would come here to speak. And I said, well, look, I looked at the program at previous events and I see all these scientists, technologists, policymakers, clinicians. And I said, Larry, I don't really do the stuff that you used to know me for doing. I don't do stuff. I just talk to entrepreneurs all day. I'm not a doer anymore. And he said, no, but you do different things. Come and talk about how you think about the world. And so in the fine tradition, I guess, of all venture capitalists, I am going to talk about the work of thousands of hardworking, smart people and take credit for it totally inappropriately, but that's what I was invited to do. And I also, to Tim's suggestion, you're certainly free to call me Larry for the rest of the day. So also, if I run roughshod of the question and answer time, you can certainly tweet any questions to me, or if you don't want to use X, I guess it's called now, you can skeet me on Blue Sky. So let's kind of get into it. So I work for a venture capital firm. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you, I think probably most of you have probably heard about many of the kinds of investments we do. I'll just highlight one of the things outside of healthcare. We get a lot of credit, a lot of criticism for many things. Things like OpenAI and DoorDash would have existed without us. Actually, I think a lot of the current investment and interest in fusion actually would not have happened without Vinod Khosla. He doesn't get any credit for it right now, but if things work the way we hope, it's going to be transformative. We are, of course, well aware of some of the things that Professor Fox talked about, that it's very expensive in terms of fossil fuel use for the environment to do things like do a lot of this AI processing. We're investing in new kinds of compute, physical technology to hopefully alleviate that, but we're very aware of it. That's not where I spend most of my time. So I head our health and biotech investing practice. I think over the last 10 years, we've grown a pretty good reputation. When I joined, people sort of made fun of me and said, oh, this AI stuff in healthcare, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You don't know how to invest. You guys are going to just lose money. And over the last 10 years, we've created and been involved in a number of interesting companies, some of which I'll talk about. There are 115 active companies in healthcare and biotech. A little bit of our philosophy. Well, a lot of people said this. Actually, John Wilbank said this in a little bit of discussion afterwards. The best way to predict the future is invent it, right? We're not traders in terms of we're not trading stock. We're not value arbitrage. We're trying to do value creation. You can't know the future, but you can invent it. Now, the other important part of that is you don't want to necessarily always follow the herd because you won't actually have interesting and differentiated impact in the world. A lot of times you actually have to do something a little different. Now, I love history. I've never heard the concept of walking backwards into the future. I love that. However, experts are experts in the past. And anytime someone tells you can't do something, check the assumptions that they're using. Actually, fusion's a great example. So the way we did diligence for that was there were some ideas about things we could do. It's a company called Commonwealth Fusion on plasma containment. And so we actually got 10 different physicists to look at it independently, and they all said first pass, no, this never work. Okay, why? We got them together, and they all said, well, da-da-da. At the end of it, they're like, well, maybe. But it was going to take $100 million to even do the first thing. And so that's the kind of thing that we like to do and how we think about the world. The other important thing is that I'm not going to say it's easy. This is always very hard work. To do important things, to do things that change the world, it is a tremendous amount of work. Now, not everything is hard work is necessarily that impactful, but everything impactful turns out to be a lot of hard work, at least in my experience. And there's common used trope, it often takes about 10 years to be an overnight success. And that's just the nature of a lot of these hard, challenging tasks. So let's give into an example of a specific hard problem. It's always good. Sorry, I apologize. The weather outside is beautiful, but I have terrible allergies, so I've had to medicate a lot because of all the tree pollen. And that's giving me a dry mouth, which maybe we could talk about a little bit of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system involved. Anyway, one of the great things that we could do for the world is we had unlimited supply of solid organs for transplantation, right? Over 100,000 people on the transplant wait list at any one time. Someone's constantly being added. Most people never make it onto the transplant wait list because their physicians realize they will not be real candidates, viable candidates. Kidneys, hearts, lungs, livers, we actually know how to transplant these organs. It's supply that's the issue. And of course, something relative to what Dana talked about yesterday, this is incredibly disproportionately allocated to vulnerable minorities for a whole bunch of reasons. The other interesting thing that we heard a little bit about earlier today is the genetics of admixed populations. And so if you actually have an admixed background, which I actually do, the chance of getting a good match actually decreases dramatically. So it would be great to find a way of engineering for this problem. Well, I know where this is going to go, right? If you can get to 100% genetic match on surface markers, you have perfect compatibility. It's not a problem, so how do we get there? Well, we heard about the genetic toolkit in CRISPR. We can start somewhere else. So we can start with the Yucatan pig. Now, why this particular animal has to do with a lot of things related to size, it's where it is for the ability, how fast it grows, how suitable it is actually from a sort of physical structural component. But of course, we have to engineer all the molecular components that actually cause hyperacute, acute, and then chronic rejection. And so we invested, along with Boris Nikolic, at the seed of eGenesis out of George Church's lab. And the idea is, well, we have this genetic engineering toolkit. Let's see how far we can push it. We know if we can get to 100% identity for the surface, a lot of markers, we basically can get perfect tolerance. Let's see how far in that path we can go. So turns out the version that we're at now has 69 specific edits. So what's hard about this? Well, why did it take so long? We're talking about this, and this is a great example of this quite 9 years, not quite 10, to actually make something work. Well, you have to get a sterile pig farm, and then you have to do all these very subtle things in the editing to make sure that the animal is robust and actually produces healthy organs that will actually work when you transport them. If you do this much editing to organism, it can be hard to actually have that fully be viable. The other component is you have to test these things. People have talked a little bit about things related to regulatory. You have to test these in primates. And the organs aren't designed for primates. Well, humans are primates. They're not designed for non-human primates, but you have to test them. And in this case, we're trying to push how long we can get the thing to work. And so the time to failure goes up and up and up. And so we actually have to do this. In some cases, the most recent studies were over 2 years of successful support in non-human primates with some of the solid organs that we've been able to transplant. So, good news that I think people may have seen, just recently we were able to transplant into the first living human with a xenotransplant from a genetically modified pig. You may have also heard that, unfortunately, about 2 months after the transplantation, he passed away of a heart attack. There's no sign that the kidney was actually in great condition. Everything went well with that. To get on the compassionate use exemption, he was kind of in a bad place health-wise. Hamilton talked a lot about how one organ system kind of having problems, like having a kidney that's failing and you're not able to fix it, can impact other systems. So he was kind of had some other things going on, but he was really in a terrible state in the inpatient setting. Transplanted kidney, he was actually able to go home. He was in great, if you know anyone that's ever had a kidney transplant, it's night and day difference in how people feel. He was able to spend a lot of time with, about a month and a half of extra time with his family at home. Okay, another example, start with a big problem. So infection is still a big problem, right? There was kind of historically, mid-late 20th century, people started saying, oh, infectious disease is not that interesting anymore because we have all these antibiotics. Well, HIV/AIDS returned, and then it got to be an interesting area. Then it started to be not an interesting area. COVID comes, now people are interested in infectious disease. Well, infectious disease has always been a problem in the background, right? Many people actually don't die, for example, of cancer. They actually die of a secondary infection subsequent to the cancer or related to its treatment. Respiratory infections, Hamilton had a slide that showed this. It was kind of off to the right, still a leading cause of death. And many people are still immunocompromised. HIV, cancer, lots of reasons. Transplants, if we go down this path that I just mentioned, you will have more immunocompromised people. Okay, so let's think about how we work on that problem. One of the challenges in a lot of these individuals who are immunocompromised is a lot of diagnostic uncertainty of what they can have. They have all kinds of opportunistic infections. When they have any kind of, let's say, a fever of unknown origin, it can be hard to diagnose. Well, we've got a couple efforts there. Again, this is another example of a company that's taken a while to get there. Sepsis kills 700 people a day many cases it's preventable. There are many dead bodies in the space, both metaphorically in terms of companies that have failed trying to do this, but also, of course, it is a horrible killer of many people. In all deference to things like proteins, they are in many cases a downstream change that starts with a change in the gene expression of white blood cells. So if you can get upstream and measure that change and report that answer in a reasonable time frame to influence care, you can get on top of things like the cascading message signaling pathways that go through cytokines all the way through the physiological changes, which is often when people present blood pressure is too low, we can prevent them from ever getting there. And so inflammatics, so what's the hard thing about this? Is, well, you just measure, you figure out this gene expression pattern, you measure it, no problem. Well, the reality is you have to get, everything I mentioned, you have to get the timing right. So the hard thing is actually to get this point of care box and the LAMP assays and get the cartridges, and that's just taken a tremendous amount of time. But we're turning a corner. Covenant got breakthrough designation. The data is coming back really positive. I think we're going to hopefully get clearance later this year and start to get to deployment. And I'm, again, for any of these things, I'm always impatient because I know the sooner I get this out there, the sooner we can save lives. Another company is already saving lives. So many of you may know about cell-free DNA for things like cancer, certainly fetal maternal health. It's the fastest growing molecular diagnostic ever is basically sampling the fetal genome in the maternal circulation. Turns out viruses, bacteria, parasites, even archaea, they're not actually pathogens, but you can measure their presence by the little pieces of DNA and RNA that they shed into the bloodstream. You don't actually have even a single culturable organism, but because oligonucleotides are amplifiable, we can measure them. And so one blood test from Karius can actually identify over 1,300 different infectious agents, which again, if you have a patient who's immunocompromised with diagnostic uncertainty, sick, child with leukemia of fevers of unknown origin, you can actually diagnose it as soon as you get the answer back. Now, it's a sequencing-based assay. And Richard, I think, and other people, I'm surprised people have not talked about sequencing costs more. But of course, we're well aware that one of the rate-limiting steps to things like the All-Us Project and others, how can we drive down the cost of actually returning these results? So we've invested heavily in areas like lab automation, sequencing. So we're seed investors in Ultima Genomics, which is really the company that started putting us back on a cost reduction curve in sequencing. The other thing, actually, the other thing that's I think important when Larry Hunter asked about how we think about things is by being involved in efforts like this, and actually OpenAI is a great example, we see where the future is going to go, and then we can make future investment decisions, company incubation decisions, with this understanding of the world to come, and we know what's possible and what enabling technology will enable us to build the next thing. Now, I would like to call out that Larry Gold said COGS yesterday at the end, and that warmed my heart. And I don't know how many bean counters at SomaLogic had to talk to you before that came out of you spontaneously, but I appreciate that because we have to be, when you're trying to figure out and deploy scalable technologies, you really have to be laser focused on actually the unit cost, the marginal cost of everything you do. Sequencing lab costs, things like that, those are incredibly important. Okay, let's move to the brain since we just heard about that. Great, Alex, you've got solutions to infections, to solid organs. Well, you can't do brain transplants. What can you do? What are you thinking about in the brain? Well, we can't transplant the brain, but the brain is an electrical system. We've talked a few minutes ago about, is it a meat computer or not? There are a lot to indicate that it has some meat computer properties. There are people approaching brain-machine interfaces a few different ways. Much of what you hear about is via sets of microneedles and a craniotomy kind of sticking into your brain. So having seen all the way back to Bob Newson's original single needle studies on primates, non-human primates, again, I have to, humans are primates. For a bunch of reasons, I don't think that's actually a scalable approach or the way for the future to actually build these kind of technologies. How do we get into the brain, into this complex network that we just heard about? Well, it has a natural highway system, right? Every part of the brain actually has to have blood vessels, both arterial and venous, to interface with it to exchange nutrients, to exchange gases. Can we use that? So we have a company that's working on smart stents. So it was actually founded in Melbourne in 2012, which is a great example of like 10 years to get to maturity. We actually discovered it through an IP search. with this idea of who has blocking IP around how do you get to whether you're in the hollow, the brain's actually hollow, it has ventricles, how do you get to the blood vessels? If you put electrical measurement and electrodes in there, who has blocking IP? And this brilliant guy, neurologist in Melbourne, Tom Oxley, did, and had been working on it year over year over year. And we found it, helped bring it to New York. This is a great example, again, Larry asked about how we think about things. Try to find something, it's a big opportunity in a big space, a different approach that we think is feasible and maybe better, but also just doing the work of finding the IP in this kind of little area. And it actually had been much more de-risked than most of the world realized. Now, there's people that hadn't really heard about this until they were able to come quickly, but later that year they got FDA IDE, started implanting patients in the US, and actually, Elon Musk tweeted that he was the first a person used a brain-computer interface to make a tweet. It's wrong, we did this 3 years ago. So brain-computer interface to me is not actually the end point. Now it's great. My uncle actually had a stroke and was paralyzed. It's really, it's important to me. Those patients, ALS patients, we enable ALS patients to communicate, to control their environment, all very important to me. But actually, I think the bigger opportunity, actually, maybe we can talk about this for a couple seconds because someone asked about this kind of general idea of increasing bandwidth, and I actually don't believe it's really feasible or even makes sense. So Glenn talked yesterday about the thalamus. It actually gates sensory input. If you have too much sensory input, it's a problem. There are likely some types of autism that involve disruption of that system and you have just overwhelming sensory input. Another way to look at it is you kind of think, your brain lies to you in lots of ways, which Max was sort of implying. Great example is you look around and you think you have a bitmap. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's only a tiny fraction of what you're seeing that is actually even in color, let alone even anything in high resolution. Most of what you're seeing are various processing of edges and movements of the periphery in black and white, and your brain fills in everything. Even how we think about color. I'm sure many of you in even like high school biology remember finding your blind spot. Right? Your brain is lying to you all the time about what you see, and I actually think it'd be quite challenging to find higher bandwidth methods of pumping information to the brain. However, the reason I'm interested in this path of using the natural highways is I actually think of sort of the soups versus sparks dichotomy of how people think about the brain is an electrical network, and can we interact with it in interesting ways rather than using pretty blunt instrument drugs along the soups model, but actually interact in a much more focused way with energy. And if we can make electricity the drug, that puts us in a very interesting path to a virtuous cycle of new therapeutic improvement. Now, people to date, of course, are using brain implants to treat things like epilepsy and Parkinson's, but I actually think there is a lot of opportunity there. We likely will be able to treat depression, addiction. Someone asked about the default mode network, and there's a lot of indication that just basal stimulation of the default mode network is as efficacious as some of the new antibody drugs for Alzheimer's, and I think there's actually a lot of space for improvement because I actually think we're just scratching the surface of what we're doing there. There's all kinds of things. For example, your brain is the master regulator of metabolism. So can we use a smart stent to treat your diabetes? I think we can, but that's all for the future. What if you don't want a brain implant? Okay, well, there's a lot we can do with transcutaneous stimulation. You can do electrical and magnetic stimulation that actually goes into the brain and provides some value. And this has been an area where there's a lot of positive and negative findings. You can look at the SAINT study that's looking at ways of targeting focused transcutaneous magnetic stimulation. But we've got one activity in the space, this company called Flow Neuroscience, multiple positive clinical trials. They're focused on depression and anxiety. Back to maybe Larry Hunter's questions about how I think about the world. I'm like, great. Depression and anxiety is such a large market opportunity. So many therapies don't quite work well. Research is really hard. If you haven't read it, there's a book called Emperor's New Drug, which is about a lot of challenges in the development of antidepressants and how hard it is to do clinical studies. But if we're on a path where, again, electricity and virtual training loops, positive feedback, things like that, not positive feedback in the general sense, but that you can learn, you have positive learning loops, you can get on, I think, in the future, a much better path for developing new therapeutics. The other things like transcranial stimulation, those are adjunctive to other therapies. And so if one thing doesn't work for you, another thing may. And again, when you have a multifactorial, very common condition, it's a big market. We just need to help a few people. And it turns out that this is one way that seems to work. We're just getting reimbursed now in the UK and Switzerland on the back of a bunch of studies we've done there. We got FDA breakthrough designation in the US and a positive pivotal trial at the end of last year. So this is kind of on its way, and it'll be available. Like I said, it's available in the UK, and they just were covering it in the BBC. So again, I'm happy things like this are available. May not be the right path for any single person's depression anxiety, but I'm glad there's another offering for people that do want to try it. Okay, well, what if depression isn't your thing? It's very common, but is it not your thing? Everybody sleeps, and most people at some point actually have sleep disruptions. So we actually funded a sleep research. Actually, I ran this company for a little while. This is an example of, again, thinking about something in a different way. We financed a sleep lab in Berkeley with some of the top sleep scientists and some great electrical engineers, looking at, again, because it's a big opportunity, and there were some hints that maybe there was something there that we could do with transcranial electric stimulation. The discovery that we found in this company was that each person actually has a personalized sleep frequency. And so if you've ever pushed someone on a swing, if you drive them with resonance, you can get them to go up higher and higher. If you go against that resonance, it's actually, you don't go anywhere, and maybe you knock them down. But every person has a signature personalized sleep frequency. To some extent, it's the opposite of epilepsy. Rather than kind of a lot of kind of chaotic activity, every person actually has slow wave activity. And if you use transcranial electric stimulation to drive to that frequency, you can actually treat many of the things that people use sleeping pills for, what's called sleep onset latency. That's the go to sleep faster, and then actually total sleep. You get that if you compress sleep onset latency, people actually sleep longer just because of that, but we also do beyond that. And the other thing is sleep quality, what sleeping pills are terrible for doing. If you actually measure many endpoints of sleep quality, this is a much better way of doing it than pharmacological interventions. And to date, we have there aren't any side effects that have been identified. So this is a product that's coming out. There'll be some new versions. So this is out now. Okay, sleep's important, but let's get back to scary diseases. Maybe to this kind of idea of let's think about the root causes. And this is something that I think about, is that are we really focused on the root causes and going after the root problem? Actually, Dana had a great, I think it's important for all of us, about this actually attribution for a lot of burden of human disease. But are we going back to the real root of a lot of these problems? So we've got an effort. Colin talked about this a little bit. Others have talked about it. There's a lot of rare diseases that have no therapeutic. We've got a few different efforts. One of the things that I believe, or we believe, is that we actually have a pretty powerful genetic toolkit. We have all kinds of genomic medicines, and they can be pretty targeted, and they have little off-target effect, which is great compared to small molecule chemistry. But one of the challenges is actually delivery. If you get into the cell and into the tissue of interest, if you can't do that, you can't treat the person. You need to get there. And so we've got some things like lipid nanoparticle, AI discovery, and other things. One fun thing is that we have a company called Bionaut that uses, actually, you can put a spinal tap needle in, and you can introduce this little bot. And they use electrically applied electromagnetic fields to drive it up through the cerebrospinal canal. Doesn't do any damage because you have fluid there. We saw from Dr. Felci. You can actually pass it up without doing any damage. You can drive it around into, again, the brain is hollow. You can drive it around and actually drop payloads of specific cells, tissue, gene therapies, et cetera, into specific targeted locations. Now, I'll kind of go to an example of like Larry asking me how maybe I think about things differently. Most biopharma investors focus on kind of one way template of looking at the world. They actually hate hardware, all kinds of things. They love to look at, for example, cancer companies. Well, we know that there are no great models of cancer, right? All the patient-derived xenografts, they all suck. Like, that's why things wouldn't fail in clinical trials if those models were actually any good. This is a great example of something that when I saw it, I'm like, well, that's just a physics problem, and you have de-risked the physics because they showed me a demo where they were doing it in a rabbit. I'm like, well, if you can do it in a tiny little rabbit, that will scale up to a human. The actual major risks of your technology are actually all done. The question then is, can you does it have efficacy of different payloads? Well, that's an open question. We can do a little search to find which payloads are the best. Now, there's some interesting components to that. The smaller you make this, the less tissue damage it does, right? If you have a big honking thing, it'll cause tissue damage to the drag. So if you make it really small, there are a lot of spaces and potential spaces in the body that it can pass through and doesn't do any damage. But it's inversely proportional to how much mass you can drop off. So this is much better suited to highly potent kinds of therapeutic modalities, such as oncolytic viruses, which haven't really demonstrated a lot of value yet, but that's promising. Other kinds of RNA therapies, cell therapies, dropping off, for example, dopaminergic neurons would be a great application. All right, but we do also have a company with this idea of we know about a lot of the things where we can do lab automation, AI drug discovery for RNA therapies. So we have a company actually focused on how do we develop a platform for an N of 1 therapeutic. So if one person in the world had a disease, how do we engineer therapy? So we happen to believe that actually RNA is probably the way to go, not a gene therapy, because with RNA therapy you can adjust dosages. If you're just developing the first time, gene therapies, anything that changes the germline genome is kind of a one-way street and a lot of issues with redosing. RNA, you can kind of back it off. So that's why, as we're thinking about N of 1, we're looking at RNA therapies that, again, Tom talked a lot about things in RNA. Okay, so I kind of dodged one of the problems, root causes of so we talked about how you go after rare diseases, genetic diseases, things that have very clearly known biology. The problem for many of us who we've gotten through the diseases of childhood and many of the genetic diseases, is actually we're getting to another problem of why we have trouble developing new therapies that are important for most of us in a lot of blockbuster conditions. So inflammation, we heard about that actually from Rurang, the classic inflammation as a major aspect. Actually, if you go after and treat inflammation, that has been one of the great sources of blockbusters because inflammation is a principal component of disease. You go after a principal component, you actually can it turns out you can impact a lot of stuff. Well, what's a major principal component of most of the diseases of unmet common diseases, right? Of course, common diseases, Hamilton sort of alluded to this, they're all heterogeneous, but broadly speaking, it's their diseases of aging. Why is that challenging to develop drugs for disease of aging? Well, the timeline of the processes evolve over often, if you're even like a dedicated researcher, you have a 25, 30-year career, you are not living long enough to see the outcome of your work if you're working on outcomes related to all-cause mortality, for example. So you have to really focus on what are the enabling technologies to get us there. The other thing that, again, people have alluded to, you've seen a few slides, is that we don't have great models for many of the diseases related to chronic disease, common disease, multifactorial disease. If you, and again, all of us will have something at some point. If you develop some condition, you probably will, at that point, wish you were a mouse, because we probably can cure it, and we may or may not be able to cure you. Okay, so we heard a few times of the Framingham study, and I actually think this is one of the most important things that has actually happened in our society related to health and medicine, and that was a shift. So prior to the Framingham study, people died of natural causes. The Framingham study actually caused a change to promote the idea of these modifiable risk factors. Cholesterol was really one of the first that emerged. Obviously, the HDL turned out not to be a target, blah, blah, blah. But cholesterol is a risk factor, right? And we then figured out that if we target that, we can prevent death. People take statins and now PCSK9 inhibitors, if they have rhabdomyolysis or whatever, really as a longevity drug. But the cycle to discover that was really about 40 years from the time that the Framingham study started, to observe some people, to think about it, to develop the statins, and of course, which one of the blockbuster drug categories. So can we do better here? We have one company, BioAge, that actually collaborates with SomaLogic. And I had thought that maybe this was the first company to take a drug to the clinic that had been developed with SomaLogic, but Larry tells me that actually was a macular degeneration drug that was sooner. But anyway, they're a clinical biopharma company. They've developed, their first drug is actually against what's called sarcopenia. So as people age, people become more frail, your muscles basically get smaller and weaken. There's a lot of things going on. Their lead program was originally developed based on this aging cohort, kind of like a couple that we heard about. I think it was John that mentioned the one in Estonia, which is part of the discovery cohort. But they use SomaLogic to discover new drugs using some of the techniques that Colin mentioned. in the clinic, they had positive results. But interestingly enough, because if you go after a principal component of illness, in this case, things related to aging, turns out it actually is beneficial for lots of things. So it may treat sarcopenia, some metabolic derangements as people age, and so forth. So that's a pretty interesting effort. For time management, Larry Hunter maybe imprudently gave me permission to run over the question answering session. And so I respect all of your time. So if you want to leave, feel free. I'll talk for a little bit, but I'll try to go fast. Because I'll be here for dinner, so you can ask me all the questions you want for hours. So senescent cells, we heard a little bit of this from Hamilton, is maybe one of the sources of some of the factors in the blood that cause deleterious effects. There's this concept of the senescence-associated secretome. So there's a company a few years ago that was founded, many of you may have heard of it, called Unity, that was going after this concept. Now they raised a tremendous amount of money, had a very high valuation, rushed probably, and we didn't think at the time a very good drug into the clinic, and we didn't think the clinical trial was going to work. Turned out not to work, and you can see where the actual enterprise value of the company is reflective of one of the challenges in biopharma, is when you do that, kind of turn that corner and take a drug to the clinic in an outcomes trial, you can destroy a lot of value if you miss the mark. We actually, before they even read out that clinical trial, like I said, maybe I was shorting the company, I feel bad, but I didn't think it was going to work. So we invested in a different company that was going after the same biology, but we thought they had a much better approach to the chemistry of the drug development itself, computational platform, a bunch of things they were doing. There's a smart way of developing senolytics. And again, to the question of how I think about the world, I like to find a thing, well, the basic biology has only been reinforced in the concept of what you could do with senolytics and the impact of if you could actually remove these senescent cells. Just because a company didn't succeed in the clinical trial doesn't mean that isn't a fruitful path. Things don't work until they do. That was the history of immuno-oncology. People knew that as an opportunity. Things didn't work until they suddenly did, and that's why we invested here. Talk about a couple more things in this space. 10 years to make to succeed. Well, a lot of dog breeds only live 10 years. So in 2002, we invested in this company going after dog aging, and everyone thought I was insane. Beginning of this year, it was actually mentioned in the Emmys. They're making a ton of progress. This will come out soon. I think it's going to be a very interesting thing. One of the things that's interesting about it is that dogs actually experience most of the human exposome, including if we don't want to, our food, right? So it's actually telling us a lot about things related to human life and human exposure. We're getting, and if you develop a drug, unfortunately, all this stuff about animal models, typically have to kill a bunch of beagles as part of it. So like dogs are very close to how we think about drug development. I am happy if this company, they're doing well. I think it's going to be a big impact, and we're going to extend a lot of opportunity for people to spend time with their pets. Okay, we're doing stuff, preterm birth, fetal maternal health, disproportionately affects lots of vulnerable communities. We're doing a bunch of things there. This is a great example of a technology that may seem crazy, but if you're able to bring all other eutherian mammals that you tested in, pigs, sheep, rodents, whatever, and you can bring them to full term with no deficits, I do think we have this pretty interesting approach with effectively an artificial uterus for preterm birth that will save, again, 1 million preterm babies a year die. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement there. And if you want to improve quality adjusted life years, go early. What about the mice? There are opportunities to move into testing on human tissues, right? I'm an investor in veterinary drugs, but on the other hand, most people actually care about human therapeutics. Well, why are we developing cures for mice when we could develop cures for humans? Well, that's the tools we have. We're doing some work with a group out of Philadelphia that has a fantastic multiplexed model of tissues. They can actually model many different human tissues, and related to things like fetal maternal health. They, for example, have a placenta model where they can test to see what can go on into what can cross the placenta and what not, and what can have impact on downstream tissues, because it's really hard to do research in pregnant women. It's actually really hard to even do non-human primate pregnancy research, just a lot of challenges. Well, let's try to do as much as we can ex vivo, combined with a lot of interesting tools with AI. AI is actually, we're really at time, so I'm gonna cut this off. I will say a couple things. I think the biggest problem in global health is we've traditionally thrown labor at the problem, not technology, and that is not a way to create an equitable and scalable system. It's only by using technology that we have actually scalable approaches. There's a little side note here. Sometimes people ask, well, AI biases, is that going to cause problems in healthcare? Data mentioned, human beings have tons of biases. Changing them is incredibly difficult. AI, when you identify it, software fix. It's great. Available everywhere, all at once. Larry Gold mentioned cell phones briefly, and Chris actually had a picture of one. Completely different trajectory. So in the 80s, having a cell phone was the signature of being a mogul, right? That's Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. What is happening in the intervening time? You could walk into many cities in the world and you'll see homeless people with smartphones. Smartphones that are literally by 1,000,000 times better in terms of processing power capabilities than the device that he had. Now, homelessness is a whole separate thing, which has a lot, again, Dana could probably talk a lot about a lot of zoning laws and things that we're not doing the right way to help. But on a technology side, I think that's amazing. We have created a technology path to enable everyone in the world effectively to have amazing powers in their pockets. What have we done in healthcare at the same time? So this is a young Denzel in St. Elsewhere. He's looking at his patient, caring, talking, having an interaction. What's happening in the intervening time? Well, you probably have this experience. You look at the back of a doctor while they're typing into a computer. Instead of making the technology your servant, you are making yourself a servant to the technology. This is actually a great example of some of the stuff that Glenn talked about. We're having people waste time on a bunch of stupid activities that we should automate the hell out of, so that the fraction of time that you really need to be spending with a diagnostician working through your problem, you can spend hours. Because the reality is, most people, when they go to the doctor, you see House, you think you're getting a detective. You're effectively getting a parking attendant that looks at what zone you're in, writes you a ticket, and sends you out. Our system is not set up for a person to actually work on it's kind of the 80-20 problem. The Pareto problem, we're not putting we should put 80% of the effort in the 20% and not the other way around. We should automate the hell out of the 80%, which is, Larry Gold warmed my heart twice yesterday because he talked about KardioMobile. And one of the things that I would argue with him about is the only reason this works is because AI interprets the EKG. All the millions of EKGs that are done a month by the users of this could not be looked at by a human cardiologist, electrophysiologist. Impossible. And this was actually the first company to get approval for FDA approval for an AI diagnostic. There's a guy called Bakul Patel who really led the charge at FDA on what you could do in digital health. Cool. But this is only scalable with AI. This is my advice to entrepreneurs that, again, something that was prompted by Larry Hunter that I think a lot of technologists and scientists repeatedly get wrong, is remembering that institutions are made up of individuals, and often to get something to fly, you have to make their life better within the organization. I see time and time again, someone effectively, and there's all different flavors of this, right? It's impossible to generalize with 100%, but a lot of people effectively trying to sell an AI tool into the person whose job you will replace, and that is not going to work. So you have to kind of understand your right levers in your sales motion to ever make any progress. Let me skip through a few more of these things. Hope you saw something new. It does take a lot of hard work and a lot of time to improve the world. So the sooner we get started, the better for all of us. Thank you. And I have a few minutes for questions, apparently.
Yeah, look at that. I think we have time for 2 questions, if anybody is interested. Yeah.
I think of, was it Carius, the company?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a company?
Yeah, so, right, one of a large stable. Infection.
Sure.
And then, so you're using RNA, you're looking at, in some senses, for general audience, the sort of waste that's a result of the virus, for example, being in the blood. So I thought that was quite interesting because I've done a lot of work on sepsis recently, and of course, there's inferred sepsis, and there's what I call real sepsis. I mean, you've actually identified something. Do you have the potential to now identify in the blood viruses that we've, as an example, have not been able to identify previously?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. So the interesting thing about the cell-free DNA that is shed, of course, is you can have tiny amounts, and this is the great thing of Taq polymerase, and then now you actually use LAMP and all these other things for amplification, and you can amplify a lot, so very minute signal. They are looking at, for example, they're doing work, for example, in the microbiome. So it turns out, depending on how you frame things, your gut is technically outside the body in some ways, right? But actually, DNA from little fragments of DNA actually can pass into the system, and you can detect them and pool all that information. So they are collecting. You liken. I might liken it a little bit to Galileo and the first telescope. So Tycho Brahe was first laying down, just looking at things. But when we had a telescope, suddenly we could see a whole bunch of more stars, and we started to learn a lot about the universe by looking at nebula and all kinds of things that came from that. There is a simple-minded thing where yes, it's being used to help diagnose, for example, immunocompromised kids with leukemia. But there is a research element where we are seeing a whole new frontier of microbes, pathogens. For example, archaea have never been indicated in a disease. We don't know. Maybe in the microbiome they're doing something. And so, yes, we're seeing new stuff, and there's new insights coming out. They're doing some work on inflammatory bowel disease and all kinds of things. Well, also, I think there are phages, right, that impact the bacteria, that impact us. So there's a whole chain. The more we look, biology is this great thing. The more you look, everything turns out to be connected to something.
Awesome. Are there any other questions up in the back? And then I'm going to turn it over to Larry Hunter to close us out.
Thank you, Alexander. I was at an ADD conference 20 years ago, and there was a booth at the conference, and the gentleman had this little gizmo, and he said, clipped it onto my earlobes. I said, oh, this isn't going to do anything. This is some sort of pseudoscience. And so he said, you better sit down. I'll come on, I don't need to sit down. But I sat down, and whoa, I really noticed it. And it was called an Alpha Stim 100, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And it deals with the alpha, beta, delta, theta waves. I guess it's the alpha wave that he said that it was inducing. And I was just wondering, getting into what you were talking about with the modality of the device that you're using to treat depression and whatnot, is that the similar technology where it's manipulating the microfrequencies in the brain to bring about an altered state of the brain waves? Thank you.
I don't know about what that particularly is, so I can't comment. My guess on roughly how you described it, though, that might have been stimulating the vagal nerve, which you heard about yesterday. And that, of course, does connect to a lot of things like blood pressure. And so it may be closer to that, as opposed to actually intracranial signaling in the brain, which, again, you have to be pretty targeted. And there is, I'm talking about it very quickly, there's, as you might imagine, it's actually pretty complex. You actually have to target particular regions with particular frequencies, some also maybe at particular timings. So there's a lot there. So I don't know that particular device, but I would say broadly, I do think we are at the age of neurotech, where we effectively were in the 70s with cardiovascular disease, where you're going to see a whole wave of new innovations. And to all deference to cardiologists, the brain is much more complex. And there will be more opportunities, just the way there are now, defibrillators, and we have all kinds of technology, EKG machines, all kinds of things. There will be a whole wave of new technologies that will be able to improve many things about how our brain interacts with the world, interacts with ourselves, interacts with our body. And I think that I'll get the little...
Great way to end. Thank you so much,
Thanks, Alex, a.k.a. Larry.
Thank you.
Over to you, Larry Hunter.
And thanks, Michelle. All right, I'm just here to say goodbye and thank you. I really appreciate all the attention. My brain is full. I learned a lot. I made some new friends, and it was great reconnecting with old ones. I hope you had as good a time as I did. Thank you, and see you next year.